Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel and I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. So welcome, and today we're going to continue with our country series where we take a deep dive into a specific country's migration situation. Today we're going to look at Singapore. We will, of course, like with all of our other country studies, look specifically at the history of migration in the country. Then we'll look at the policy of migration in the country, and then the modern day situation of migration. So I'm just going to kick off right now and start with the history of migration in Singapore. I'll talk a little bit about the pre-independence period, then the Japanese occupation, the post-war merger and independence from 1945 to 1965, the early post-independence period, and then really the period up until today of trying to unify a more segregated country. So let's just jump right in. For those of you that don't know, Singapore is located within Southeast Asia. It's an island nation, a small island nation surrounded by water. And when it was first founded in 1819, there were reportedly only 150 fisher folk on the entire island. Now, it's very different from what it is today, of course. So let's jump right into the pre-independence period between 1819 and 1942, when Singapore was a British colony. The native population, though, in Singapore at the time and also current day are ethnic Malays. Now, at this time, it was regarded as a free port by many Europeans, and the population reached 10,000 by 1824 because of large trade that was going on in the region, and it was a really bustling trade and port country. It had already reached a trading volume of $22 million within the first 5 years of the country being founded by the British. In this beginning period also, it was a largely uncontrolled period of immigration from neighboring countries. And you saw the majority of migrants also at this time coming in as Chinese coolies or laborers at this period. Then there were new policies and reorganization of the colony from 1822 on. Here we saw the Raffles Plan of Singapore, which gave ethnic subdivisions of residential areas as a way to handle conflict between the different ethnic subgroups. There was also a divide and rule policy between the Chinese, Malays, Indians, and other minority groups in the country. Now, this separation of ethnic groups was according to geographical and regional areas in which they were also ruled differently. So, for example, some groups, for instance, those that were mostly ethnic Malays and were also natives, were given more concessions as compared to other ethnic groups that were seen as quote-unquote immigrants. And this was actually despite the fact that many of these quote-unquote immigrants were already second or third generation in the country. So the ethnic groups were allowed to have private schools taught in their own ethnic languages, and many of these ethnic and language-based or religious-based educational institutes that were born during this period still exist today in Singapore. By 1826, there were more ethnic Chinese than native ethnic Malays in the country. And in 1953, there was the introduction of the immigration restriction by the colonial government. And this restricted free movement across the Malay Peninsula to economic or compassionate grounds. And there was a relative economic prosperity during this time, which actually contributed to encouraging more migrants to come into the country from China and India. Now, between 1942 and 1945, of course, during World War II, there was the occupation of the Japanese in the country. There was a further divide between the treatment of the different ethnicities in the country, and there was also the removal of hostilities across Singapore and Malaysia, which was called the Sojourn operation in 1942. And through this, it was estimated that around 50,000 ethnic Chinese were removed from the peninsula. So at this time, of course, migration slowed, and at least migration to Singapore slowed. And in the post-Japanese occupation period, so just afterwards, we really saw a refugee outflow due to the communist insurrection in the 1950s, but the actual numbers of the outflow are unknown. If we shift now to a kind of post-war situation where we had both a merger with Malaysia and then independence, we look at the period between 1945 and 1965. Here, there was a decolonization process soon after the Japanese occupation. In 1963, there was an actual merger with Malaysia, so the big neighbor to the north. But there was a lot of racial and political tension due to differences in ethnic mix and economic growth. And by 1965, there was a separation of the two countries, and Singapore gained its independence in 1965. This was also the end of free movement between Singapore and Malaysia. Now, in the early post-independence period, so this is really from 1965 onwards, net migration fell due to increasing opportunities in origin countries, so not as many people were then coming to Singapore. But there was also a declining natural birth rate and an aging population, which resulted in a dwindling labor force in the country. And this made a policy shift towards encouraging immigration in the country. And between 1980 and 1990, there was nearly 200,000 people, or at least net migration in the country. And between 1990 and 2000, they saw over 600,000 in net migration to a relatively small country. And this accounts for approximately 2/3 of the population increase during this time. So really, immigration was a very important way in which population increased during this time. So asylum is not something that is really important in Singapore's history, but between 1978 and 1996, Singapore did host 32,457 asylum seekers from Vietnam, but these were largely handled by UNHCR. And by the end of the 90s, these were mainly resettled to third countries, and a few that remained were repatriated back to Vietnam. This was really just a holding ground for the Vietnamese to be resettled to other countries. If we look now onto kind of a post 1965 up to modern day, what the country was really focused on was unifying a segregated and ethnically segregated country. Now, that meant that in 1966, there was a bilingual policy for all students in public schools. There was this real idea of language policies and trying to make sure that more languages were spoken in the country and that the country was also unified around certain languages. The idea here was that English and one other mother tongue need to be taught in schools, so that could have been Mandarin or Malay or Tamil. And there was also the encouragement of a third language. And the Ministry of Education at this time was offering French, German, Japanese, and Spanish for O-levels. By 2007, there were classes in conversational Chinese and Malay offered in public schools also. And in 1989, there were ethnic quotas for housing and the development board neighborhoods. So the idea here was that there was really an ethnic integration policy that is still present today, with quotas for ethnicities in the different housing blocks, trying to make sure that there was more mixing of the groups as opposed to segregation between the different groups. So that just gives you a quick look at the history of migration in Singapore. Please check out the next videos to see what migration looks like today in Singapore and also the migration policies today.